This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Businessweek Daily with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec, live on Bloomberg Radio, television, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals.
A very good afternoon, everyone. Live on Bloomberg TV, radio, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. It is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily. I'm Tim Stenovec. That is Emily Graffeo from the Bloomberg News cross-asset team. She's in for Carol Massar today. Carol is out. We got a big show, Emily. All eyes focused on Washington, D.C.
Yep, that's right, Tim. This is where President Volodymyr Zelenskiy is meeting with Trump and a number of EU leaders, including EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, among a number of other European leaders, of course, to hash out potentially getting to an end of this Russia-Ukraine war.
Well, the White House and the president's meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy, the two of them just wrapping up this press conference in the Oval Office. Now they are meeting without press there. The president, though, at the end of that press conference, he did say he'll call Russian President Vladimir Putin after meeting with Zelensky and European leaders at the White House. Emily mentioned a few of the names. There are more than half a dozen who came in specially for today. They actually met with Zelensky earlier in the day before heading to the White House. We're going to be all over everything happening at the White House and in Washington, D.C. throughout the program. Our team on the ground with the latest from the White House and a possible end to this war, Emily.
We're also going to be speaking with our senior geoeconomics analyst for Europe, who's going to join us from Geneva with analysis. And the Trump administration is in discussions to take a stake of about 10% in Intel. We'll get an update from the Bloomberg exclusive on that Thursday.
Stocks lower fractionally, but standing by with an update on exactly how markets are doing and all the business news. Here he is, Charlie Pilot.
Thank you very much. And here's what's going on from Washington to Wall Street to Jackson Hole. We got you covered here at Bloomberg. Right now, we are looking at a down day for the Dow, the S&P, and the NASDAQ Composite Index. Wall Street holding its breath ahead of Jackson Hole. S&P right now down 864.41. That is a drop of 0.1%. The Dow lower now by 66, down 0.1%. NASDAQ Composite Index down 34, a drop there of 0.2%. Our Mag 7 Index down 0.4% on a down day for the broader market. The Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares is gaining 0.4%. The 10-year 4.33%, with the 2-year 3.76%. Gold lower little change, down under 0.1%, 33.33 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.9%, 63.38 a barrel on WTI, and Bitcoin $116,500. Bitcoin down by 1%. Sources tell Bloomberg the Trump administration is in discussions to take a stake of about 10% in Intel. Intel down now by 3.2%. Recapping stocks lower, S&P down 8, down 0.1%. And for on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks for that update, Charlie. Do appreciate it. We begin in Washington, D.C., where the president is meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy and other European leaders as we speak. These two, along with Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, they spoke to reporters from the Oval Office earlier today. Here's what President Zelenskiy partly had to say.
We need to stop this war, to stop Russia, and we need support American and European partners. And we will do our best for this. I think we show that we are strong people, and we supported the idea of the United States, personally of President Trump, to stop this war, to make a diplomatic way of finishing this war. And we are ready for trilateral, as President said. This is a good signal about trilateral. I think this is very good.
There you have it. President Zelenskiy at the Oval Office just in the last hour speaking to reporters alongside President Trump. We've got with us Bloomberg News managing editor for U.S. economy and government, Mario Parker. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Mario, we're going to get to the strategy, the possible end of this conflict here, but I think it's important to note that the last time these two sat alongside one another in the Oval Office back in February, it was a lot more contentious, a very different tone to today's press conference.
Everything about it, Tim, was 180 degrees different than what we saw earlier this year, right, when one of the most brusque displays in the Oval Office in recent memory. What we saw when President Zelensky even arrived from the White House, he had a suit on, right, which was the starting point of the contention during the last meeting. He and President Trump exchanged some friendly banter about the president's attire as well. And then that warm tone carried over into the Oval Office spray that we just saw.
What do we understand right now about what is the current position of the other European leaders that are in attendance at the White House right now?
Well, it's unclear exactly what the position is right now. One of the positions, I mean, obviously, the fact that they all harried, some of the most powerful leaders in all of Europe, hurried to Washington, D.C. to be here. And I think that not to be lost with the comment that we just talked about with the attire, you can see that Zelensky was coached and prepared by some of his counterparts in Europe who understand the stakes right now. Just given the about face that President Trump has made in the last couple of weeks, we saw the president go from threatening secondary sanctions on Russia, India for buying Russian oil, and then he had the meeting on Friday in Alaska, in which he came out largely understood to be towing the line that Vladimir Putin had suggested about a peace agreement before a ceasefire. So you could see Europe wanting to make sure that the United States doesn't pressure Zelensky into taking a deal that would threaten that alliance with NATO, but also cede too much territory from Ukraine.
Well, help us understand where the daylight remains here between the U.S.'s position and perhaps the European position. Is it fair to say, Mario, that the European allies, at least who showed up alongside with President Zelensky today, they want the exact same thing that Zelensky wants? Or perhaps a better way of saying that is they would be willing for Ukraine to give up and ask for the same things to end this conflict? Are they aligned here?
I think it is safe to say that Zelensky and the European allies are very much so aligned. Now, a couple of things that came up during the spray that we knew about as well. President Trump was non-committal but not hostile toward the idea of some type of U.S. security guarantee. That lines up with our reporting over the weekend that Europe and Ukraine wanted some type of guarantee of U.S. backing going forward as to prevent or deter Vladimir Putin from launching another attack at some point against the country, vis-a-vis what happened after Crimea as well. Some of that, again, President Trump seemed open to without necessarily committing U.S. troops or intelligence. He characterized some of the support on our artillery and weapons as being sold to NATO and essentially making their way to Ukraine, as opposed to just handouts, is how he characterized it previously.
Zelensky said that Ukraine is ready for a trilateral meeting with Russia and the U.S. I'm wondering how realistic you think that is, that we do get that trilateral meeting, and what we could see come out of that potential meeting.
Well, I think it's a positive sign that Zelensky invoked it, because we know that that's something that President Trump dearly wants, right? So part of the gambit with Trump and the dynamic, I should say, between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky is that everyone knows that Trump really wants an end to this war. He kind of alluded to it as much in this Oval Office spray, where he said that he thought that this war would be one of the easiest to solve. Recall the campaign pledges that he made to satisfy it on day one. He says that it's been much harder for him to get to that result. A trilateral agreement, according to the two men, would signal that some progress has been made, both in this bilat with Zelensky, also coming off the heels of the bilat with Putin, and then whatever the White House discusses with the European leaders, and find if they are able to find some common ground as well. So a trilat would signal something going in the right direction, and the fact that Zelensky seems open to a trilat also is a positive sign there.
Mario, based on your reporting and the reporting from the Bloomberg team, the analysis, the analysts that you and the team have spoken to, is it realistic to think that this war could end without Ukraine giving up some sort of territory?
That, based off of our reporting, that does not seem very likely. It'll come down to what parts or what territory Ukraine would be willing to cede. We saw President Trump over the recent days mentioning Crimea, specifically, that Ukraine wouldn't get that back. We know that Putin would like the eastern flank of the country, representing about a fifth or so of Ukraine's territory, maybe possibly even solidifying the battle lines from the war. Whether or not Ukraine will be on board with that, whether or not that's too much of a price for Europe as well, we'll see. But I think it's fair to say, based off of our reporting, that some territory will be, at the very least, some territory will be ceded to Russia.
Hey, before we let you go, Mario, speaking of your reporting and the team's reporting, Bloomberg News reporting that the Trump administration is set to discuss taking a 10% stake in Intel. This is a follow-up to the Thursday exclusive from our Bloomberg News deals team. What have we learned since then about what this stake could look like?
Well, it looks like it's moved forward. Last week, we reported that was something that was on the table. Today, we reported that it does look like that's a 10% stake or so, to the tune of some $10 billion, $10 billion plus dollars. It would be essentially grants under the Chips and Science Act that would be converted into a U.S. stake into the beleaguered chips maker.
All right, Mario Parker, managing editor for U.S. Economy and Government, joining us from Washington, D.C. Well, speaking of Washington, D.C., and back to what's happening at the White House, our own colleague Enda Curran writing on the live blog, which you can find on the Bloomberg terminal and at Bloomberg.com, that the outcome of today's discussions on Ukraine and Russia has important ramifications for global inflation, given the potential for an impact on oil and gas prices. I want to bring in Jim Bianco, founder and president of Bianco Research. It focuses on macroeconomics and the implications for financial markets, as well as provides market commentary. He joins us from Chicago. Jim, why did you want to talk about Jackson Hole and what you think of Jay Powell's task ahead of him, the rethink of the American labor picture? We're going to get to that. But since we are so focused on Washington, D.C., from a macro perspective, how are you watching what's happening at the White House today?
Oh, with great interest, because I think it is what Enda just said. It's about whether or not we get a deal that will bring some stability to the oil market, or we don't get a deal and it adds more instability to the oil market. Russia is the largest oil producer in the world. They are a larger oil producer than Saudi Arabia or the United States. So they matter on the margin. And if the world is trying to either sanction them or ostracize them, it matters. If we don't get a deal, President Trump has opened the door to potentially sanctioning Russian oil, and it would matter at the margin.
So, Jim, for Jackson Hole this year, just pivoting here to that economic symposium, the theme is labor markets in transition, demographics, productivity, and macroeconomic policy. What are you expecting the discussions to sound like at Jackson Hole this week?
Simply, what's happened in the U.S. over the last 120 days is probably the most underreported story right now. The border is closed. That's not underreported. The population growth of the United States has slowed to potentially the slowest point in American history, because all of our population growth is really coming from immigration, and we have none right now. President Trump even went as far to say we have net negative immigration, where more people are leaving the country than entering. And that might be the first time in American history. So why does that matter? Because of the payroll report that we saw last month that's sparking all this debate about a rate cut. If you have no growth in the population of the country, you're going to have no growth in jobs. And that's to be expected. Cutting interest rates to stimulate growth back to some 80,000, 100,000, 120,000 jobs assumes that there's a certain population growth in the country. If that is not the case, all rate cuts do is create inflation. This is what the Fed is going to talk about: labor market productivity and demographics. And what does that mean for the labor market? And I'll tease you, the American Enterprise Institute put out a paper on this last month. They suggested that by next year, if this state of population growth near zero holds, that any payroll report above zero might be enough jobs for the United States. Now, we would think of it as a recession, or we would think of it as something terrible because we're still used to a country that has a modest level of population growth. But now with the border closed, it really does have a big impact on economic growth.
Jim, I think there are a lot of implications here, not to mention, of course, what happens to Social Security and the workers who pay into that as the working population ages, but also just when it comes to growth in general. Like you said, immigrants from a growth perspective and from a population growth perspective have been keeping the U.S. afloat for years because we're not having enough babies. What does it mean for actual productivity in the U.S.?
Well, it's going to be a drag on productivity, I think, initially. And the big hope is that AI is going to offset that somewhere down the line. Now, count me as one of those that does think that AI is as big as the internet, or it's going to be bigger than the internet. But I also believe the Bill Gates line, too, that he said about technological advances, that over the next couple of years, technology will probably do less than what you think. But over the next 10 years, it'll probably do more than what you think. So we've shut the border now. There's no population growth now. Will AI come in later this year, next year to offset that? Probably not. How about in 5 or 8 or 10 years? Probably will. But over the next several years, it's not going to be able to, make up for that lower population growth. Remember, the biggest driver of economic growth for any country, you got to start with your population growth.
Yeah.
If your country's growing, you're going to have more growth. If your country is not growing, you're only going to be able to have growth to the extent that you have productivity. Beyond that, you're not going to have any much more growth.
Right. Look at China and look at Japan for examples of this. The question I have, though, is about the actual jobs that AI can help augment and the workers that are not coming to the U.S. now as a result of immigration policy. AI is not going to build houses or be construction workers. AI is not going to be food delivery workers. AI is not going to be plumbers.
No, it's not going to be all of those, but also, that is a portion of the labor growth that we've had from immigrants. They've also taken white-collar jobs or office jobs. That's really what AI is looking to try and automate, is that. Let's also keep in mind, too, and I'll quote Bob Gordon, who's a professor at Northwestern University, who's done some work on technological growth, that any technological advance like AI will lead usually to a net creation of jobs. And to put it in stark terms, there's been estimates that AI over the next decade plus might eliminate 50 million jobs. It'll probably create 60 or 70 million jobs. The problem is, I don't know the 60 or 70 million jobs it's going to create because those are in industries that don't exist. I can identify the 50 million jobs it might do away with. You could start with automated driving, and you could start with the job of driver, which is the most popular job in the United States. I think it's like 12 million people list on their tax reforms that their job is driver, whether it's bus driver, taxi driver, forklift driver, or anything in between. And so, yeah, I understand those jobs will go away, but it will lower the cost of transportation, and it will open up whole new industries that don't exist. Think of what the App Store did a couple of years ago when Steve Jobs held up the Apple iPhone 1. Did anybody say, oh, that's the end of the taxi industry, or that's going to forever change the hotel industry with Airbnb within 3 or 4 years? That's what technology changes do. They create jobs as much as they displace jobs.
Jim, love it when you join us. Thank you for taking the time this afternoon. We went a lot of places with you. It's exactly what we wanted to do. Jim Bianco, founder and president of Bianco Research out there in Chicago. Coming up next, we are absolutely laser focused on Washington, D.C. We're going to be joined by our senior geoeconomics analyst for Europe for Bloomberg Economics. He's out there in Geneva with the European perspective. Markets slightly down. This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A move lower for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ back to work Monday. We are looking at losses right now on the S&P 500 index, down 8 to 64.41, a decline of 0.1%. Dow Industrials lower by 73, a drop there of 0.2%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 27, down 0.1%. The Russell 2000 Index higher on a down day for the rest of the market. Russell 2000 up by 0.4%. Our Mag 7 index down now by 0.4%. 10-year at 4.33%. The 2-year 3.76%. Spot gold is down 0.1%, 33.32 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude up 1%, 63.45 a barrel. And Bitcoin now down 1.1% at 116,369 on Bitcoin. Sources tell Bloomberg the Trump administration is in discussions to take a stake of about 10% in Intel. Intel down now by 2.5%. Economic data, homebuilder confidence fell this month to match the lowest level since 2022. Among homebuilders today, Toll Brothers up 0.8%. Pulte little changed, up under 0.1%, and KB Home down 0.8%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks for that update, Charlie. Staying with our top story today, what's happening in Washington, D.C. between President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy, and also leaders of more than half a dozen European countries in Washington, D.C. as well. I want to bring in Antonio Barroso, Senior Geoeconomics Analyst Europe for Bloomberg Economics. Antonio joins us from Geneva. Antonio, I want to kick off a question to you that I kicked off to Mario Parker last hour, and that had to do with the goals of Volodymyr Zelenskiy and the European allies who are there with him. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, Finnish President Alexander Stubb, among others. Are there goals aligned with Zelenskyy's goals?
Oh, I think European leaders' goals are completely aligned with those of Zelensky. Look, I think the main goal is you take into account the fact that neither Zelensky nor the European leaders were at the table during the meeting between Trump and Putin. They want to make sure that they won't be at the menu. And by that, I mean that they want to make sure that they show openness to a peace negotiation with Russia, to keep Trump engaged, to keep the United States engaged in Ukraine, while at the same time trying to avoid having to accept concessions that might be detrimental to the sovereignty of Ukraine and even to the long-term security of Europe.
Isn't any concession of land detrimental to the sovereignty of Ukraine, though, Antonio?
It is, but Zelensky and Kiev has shown a certain flexibility to negotiate around the front line. What is not acceptable for Ukraine is basically reports that Putin might have suggested a land swap by which they will control the full Donbas. And essentially Ukraine giving up on territory that Russia doesn't control, especially because of the strategic dimension of that territory. So, yes, obviously, in any negotiation about territory, there might be some loss of sovereignty. But I think the important thing here in a negotiation about peace is about the long term, and it's about the fact that there is a strong and credible deterrence on the ground that will allow Ukraine to fend off future Russian, or at least deter Russia from future invasions.
The meeting is underway right now. I'm curious just what you make more broadly about exactly what kind of progress we're going to see come out of this meeting in terms of this war getting one step closer to coming to a close. Are we going to see any progress, really?
I think we will see some clarity, to be honest. I think there were a lot of contradicting narratives coming out of the Trump-Putin meeting. We saw, for example, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying, look, we are not close to a deal and a ceasefire is not off the table, while President Trump said effectively that Ukraine should go straight to a ceasefire, right? Sorry, to a peace deal, not to a ceasefire, right? So I think Europeans and Zelensky are going to get some clarity on what can be negotiated. And then, as I said, show openness to that negotiation to make sure that they're not the ones blamed for any potential failure in the peace negotiations. I think when you look at the positions of Ukraine and the position of Russia, they remain quite far apart. So we believe that a swift peace agreement, a quick resolution, the quick win that Trump is looking for is going to be very hard to get there.
I want to talk about security guarantees and what that means in your view, Antonio, based on your analysis, the team's analysis. A security guarantee, a guarantee is only as good as a guarantee. It's somebody's word. What is a security guarantee in this context? In the context of a Russia that has shown that it won't abide by guarantees of the past?
Well, you're absolutely right. In this case, a deterrent force is only as credible as the military that is backing it, right? And that's why European leaders want the U.S. to be engaged in any kind of security guarantee, because let's face it, the U.S. is the most powerful military in the world. So I think, some of the issues that are going to be discussed and that need to be clarified is, first, when Trump talks about the U.S. being implicated in this security guarantee, what is he talking actually about? In the past, he has refused to put U.S. troops on the ground. Is he talking about providing some sort of extra support, air, et cetera, et cetera? So I think the main thing to clarify first is what role is the U.S. going to play if there are security guarantees on the ground, and then how this is going to be a structure if Europe is going to be, at the end of the day, leading that security guarantee, that deterrent force on the ground.
What would be the best case outcome for Ukraine here, in your view?
Well, the best case outcome for Ukraine is one in which they get a ceasefire, first of all. I think Ukrainian President Zelensky has made very clear that he wants a ceasefire and that essentially the killings will stop. But then, if there is a negotiation, that it is a negotiation in which he's not forced to accept things that cannot be accepted at home, right? Because let's not forget, in international negotiations, leaders normally negotiate at two levels. They negotiate at the international level. In this case, will be Zelensky, Trump, Putin, the Europeans. But then there is domestic politics, right? So Zelensky needs to be able to sell whatever he negotiates at the international level at home. So I think, as I said, the main thing is a ceasefire for the time being. And then if there is a peace negotiation, something that he actually can sell at home and is acceptable for Ukrainian people.
What does it seem like the U.S. appetite is for continued support, at least from the perspective of sending weapons, or perhaps sending weapons to other European countries that then are able to sell them to Ukraine or give them to Ukraine? What is the U.S. appetite for that?
Well, I think the U.S. Administration stance towards Ukraine has sort of slightly changed since the beginning of the year. Let's not even go to weapons yet. We can talk about sanctions, right? So there has not been any movement from the point of view of the U.S. on additional Russian sanctions. Now Trump is saying, well, it actually Putin doesn't show a true willingness to move towards peace. I might actually impose additional sanctions, right? He talks about secondary sanctions and the like. So that shows that there has been a slight change in that regard. Trump has said repeatedly that he will be willing for the U.S. to continue selling weapons as long as Europeans pay for it. And I think, not only on the U.S. side, also Europeans have become more aware of the fact that the future of Ukraine's defense lies with them, right? And that they are willing to actually step up and pay for those U.S. weapons that are critical to Kiev's security. We were talking about the best case scenario. The worst case scenario for Kiev will be one in which the U.S. completely withdraws all support, including crucial operational intelligence, and that essentially Kiev and Europe are left to essentially defend Ukraine by themselves. I think that would be the worst case scenario for the Zelensky.
Bloomberg has reported that Russia's economy looks to be weakening. I'm wondering how much leverage you think that gives Ukraine and the EU more broadly.
Well, I think it gives it leverage if Europe is able to convince the US, and more specifically Trump, who is the key decision maker, that additional sanctions should be imposed on Russia to go further in the effort to hurt the Russian economy. But Trump is not there yet. We have seen it, like following the meeting between Trump and Putin, there was no talk of secondary sanctions. He mentioned, those are off the table for now. So, the ability of Europe, the US, and Ukraine to put more economic pressure on Russia depends on their ability to impose sanctions. And for now, Europe has been pushing for more. In fact, President von der Leyen, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has announced that a 19th package of sanctions is coming on the EU side. But you really need the US on your side, basically, for those sanctions to bite quite a lot on the Russian economy.
We're speaking with Antonio Barroso, Senior Geoeconomics Analyst Europe for Bloomberg Economics. He joins us from Geneva, Switzerland. We're also looking at pictures right now from the White House where we expect a family photo, a so-called family photo, President Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskiy, alongside other European leaders, including European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and Finnish Prime Minister Alexander Stubb expected to appear a little bit later. We will bring you those images when they do appear. In the meantime, I want to get back to our conversation with Antonio. Antonio, I'm wondering from the perspective of European security. I just listed off a name of more than half a dozen European leaders. Obviously, this is incredibly important to the entire continent. Is this a Russia that is more emboldened than it was 3.5 years ago and has more territorial expansion aims than it had 3.5 years ago? In other words, is this a Russia that greater Europe has to be worried about?
Well, I think that's the fear among several European countries. And I think this explains to a large extent why so many European countries are rallying so strongly behind Zelensky, because they realize that fighting in Ukraine is actually cheaper than a long-term confrontation, or cheaper in terms of, by the way, economic terms and in terms of human lives, that having to fight a wider war with Russia in the long term. Bloomberg Economics, we try to model different impact of different types of conflict with Russia, between Europe and Russia. And the worst case scenario is one in which Russia might attack the Baltic countries, right? Which will be, really negative for Europe. So I think there is a concern that Russia has territorial expansions beyond Ukraine. I think different European countries, I think this perception of the threat, it's true that it changes and varies across different countries. The perception of the Russian threat is not the same in the capital of Poland, Warsaw, than in the capital of Spain, Madrid. But overall, I think there is a significant number of European countries that fear that what might be next after Ukraine might be actually a wider confrontation with Russia. And that's why they are putting so much support behind Ukraine.
What does that support look like with or without the United States?
Well, that support already looks is starting to shape up a little bit like a wall in which Europe carries the burden of supporting Ukraine in the bulk of support, at least. Right now, Europe supplies more in terms of monetary cost of weapons and financial aid, supplies more aid to Ukraine than the United States. However, the key problem here is that the U.S. supplies some key things that Ukraine needs. For example, as I mentioned, operational intelligence, crucial for Ukraine's war efforts. Things such as key weapon systems, HIMARS, Patriot missiles, things that are actually quite important in the efforts by Ukraine to defend itself. So I think if the U.S. were to withdraw, I think in monetary terms, Europe has the funds. It can find the funds to help Ukraine. The problem is it doesn't have some of the capabilities that Ukraine requires and that, frankly, only the United States, at this stage at least, can provide.
Do you think we learned anything after the Trump-Putin Alaska meeting, or even just what we've seen from the tone of the meeting at the White House today, about where the U.S. is currently standing on potentially wanting to withdraw that support? Have we learned anything new about that?
Well, I have to say, with Trump, it's always difficult because, he at the beginning of the year, he was extremely critical of Ukraine. We all remember now, it's written in the books of history, how, that meeting between Zelensky, Trump, and U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, in which there was open conflict essentially in the air for everyone to see. Now he seems to have changed at least his stance towards Zelensky, his stance towards Ukraine. He became much more, let's say, aware of the fact that Putin might be stalling any kind of peace talks, and that he was delaying efforts to achieve peace, which is essentially, at the end of the day, what Trump wins is to get a peace deal and to be the mediator or to be the generator of that peace. So I think Trump's opinion has changed quite a lot in the last months. Now, the question is whether, if he considers that he really needs a quick win, a quick peace deal, the question is whether he sees that both parties, Russia and Ukraine, are not getting to a deal, whether he says, okay, that's enough, I'm just pulling out because I tried and I cannot get a peace deal, right? I think, as I said, that's the worst case scenario for Ukraine, and it will be, in terms of the Russian war efforts, will be the best case scenario for Putin.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm really struggling to understand is what peace looks like if there is no ceasefire, or what an end to the war looks like, or some sort of negotiation if a ceasefire is not included. Is that even a possible scenario to talk about?
Well, the thing is that you look at international peace negotiations normally. I mean, the sequence, you normally get a ceasefire, and then you negotiate things such as territorial concessions, which, by the way, are always one of the most difficult things to negotiate. I mean, we're talking about countries giving up on their land, right? Especially in the 21st century, where interstate war had practically disappeared. So I think we are putting a little bit the cart before the horses here now. The question is whether in the path to a peace agreement, whether actually Zelensky, the Europeans, and Trump can put for an actual ceasefire so the killing can stop. Because otherwise, Putin, this favors Putin's strategy, which is to continue making territorial advances on the ground while not having to concede anything, right? So I think I completely agree with you. It's difficult to see how you get to a peace settlement right away. At some point, the violence needs to stop.
We were speaking with Bloomberg News' Mario Parker a little bit earlier in this hour, and we were talking about just kind of zooming out whether or not some territory will most likely have to be ceded to Russia for this war to come to an end. What's your take on that right now?
Well, it's a tough one because, as I said, it's difficult for Zelensky to accept that any territory might be ceded to Russia. Now, that being said, I think there is also a recognition of the facts on the ground, right? And that Russia has occupied territory, that maybe Zelensky is willing to negotiate not to recognize de jure, that means legally recognize that Russia holds those territories, but to de facto say, okay, for now, Russia holds them because they have the military advantage. And, if this is what it is required to make peace, that might be a possibility. But as I said, it's really difficult politically for Zelensky because any kind of sessions in terms of territory are very politically difficult for a leader that essentially has vowed to fight until the end, right? So you might well see that maybe some territorial concessions might be part of a deal, but in no scenario that will mean that Ukraine legally recognizes those territories as Russian. So it might be more sort of a de facto acknowledgement that peace needs to be, that essentially the war needs to be frozen at the current front lines.
We're looking at a shot of the White House right now where we do expect to see more than half dozen European leaders along with President Trump and President Zelensky when they do appear for what is referred to as that family photo. We're also speaking to Antonio Barroso, Senior Geoeconomics Analyst Europe for Bloomberg Economics. He joins us with the European view from Geneva. On that European view, let's say that Ukraine does indeed have to cede territory to Russia. Does that mean that people who live in that part of Ukraine will now be Russians?
Well, these are all questions that are very hard to answer because we are not even there. As I said, territorial concessions are really the last thing that you normally negotiate in any peace discussions because, as I said, they are the most difficult thing to do. I think the key issue for Zelensky now is trying to get some sort of ceasefire where the killing can stop, and then with the backing of the Europeans and with the backing of the United States, try to get an arrangement that actually works for him and works for the Ukrainians. The key problem here is that the positions of Kiev and Moscow remain so far apart that getting that quick win that Trump wants is going to be extremely difficult.
Antonio Barroso, Senior Geoeconomics Analyst Europe for Bloomberg Economics, joining us from Geneva. Antonio, appreciate you taking the time this afternoon. Thank you so much. Hey, I do want to get on over to Charlie Pellet because he's been watching the markets and watching all the business news happening. Hey there, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much. Little change for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ right now. Interestingly, on a down day for the rest of the market, the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares is pushing higher, looking at a gain of roughly 0.4% on the Russell, but the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red. Little change, perhaps the key takeaway at this hour. Right now, the S&P is down 6, drop there of 0.1%. Geopolitics certainly coming into play. We've got the Dow down 66, down 0.1%. 0.1%. Nasdaq Composite Index down 18 right now, a drop there of 0.1%. Your 10-year at 4.33%, with a 2-year currently yielding 3.76%. Gold is down 0.1%, 33.31 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude now up 1.1%, 63.48 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin down 1%, 116,510 on Bitcoin. Sources tell Bloomberg the Trump administration is in discussions to take a stake of about 10% of Intel. Right now, Intel shares, they're down 3.3%. And Novo Nordisk is slashing the cost for Ozempic for cash-paying patients to $499 a month through NovoCare and partnering with Good RX Holdings to offer it at the same price as U.S. pharmacies. Novo Nordisk shares, they're up by 4.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie. As we've been talking about throughout the program today, our top story is what's happening in Washington, D.C. The conversations happening between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy and President Trump of the United States, alongside more than half a dozen European leaders. We're awaiting what's referred to as a family photo of those European leaders and the president. You can see that there on the screen if you're watching us on Bloomberg TV, YouTube, or Bloomberg Originals. We'll bring you that image and any commentary as we do get it. Right now, the latest, though, is that the discussions in Washington are continuing. As we read a little earlier on the program, Enda Curran on our Bloomberg News economics team, noting on our live blog that the outcome of today's discussions on Ukraine and Russia has important ramifications for global inflation, given the potential for an impact on oil and gas prices. I want to broaden the conversation a little and bring in Alaina Anderson. She's got about a $1.1 billion fund. She joins us from Chicago. That fund is the William Blair International Leaders Fund. It's up close to 17% this year. Alaina, good to have you with us. Appreciate you joining us. I want to start big picture and talk a little bit about this geopolitical environment, because if I look at the Bloomberg terminal, WILIX US is the ticker for the William Blair International Leaders Fund. When you think about geographic allocation for this, more than 11% is the UK, more than 8% is France, more than 8% is Germany. The three leaders of those countries are in Washington, D.C., doing these negotiations right now. How do you invest against a backdrop of geopolitical uncertainty such as this?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the question. We think that there are several factors that are impacting the current market backdrop, and we think that the current backdrop, despite the geopolitical turmoil that you mentioned, is quite favorable for non-U.S. equities. Chief among those factors is that growth differentials between U.S. and non-U.S. jurisdictions are narrowing. And they're narrowing because of tariffs that we expect to take a bite out of U.S. household income wealth. We'll probably start seeing that here in the second half. They're narrowing because of shifts in policy priorities that are happening abroad. You're seeing investments in growth and competitiveness that are being deployed outside the U.S., and we expect to see inflections in growth because of that. And then they're narrowing because of some concerning macro developments here in the U.S. Think rising deficits, weak dollar, inflation that's been sticky to the downside. So all of these elements, combined with the fact that valuations in the U.S. are quite full, make that valuation per unit of growth equation quite favorable for non-U.S. equity investing.
Tim mentioned that your fund has top geographic allocations to a number of countries in Europe. How are you thinking right now, though, about countries outside of the European Union? Is that an area that you would want to be investing a significant amount of the fund in?
Certainly. Europe has been well discussed, I think, as a place where growth is inflecting, whether that be because of defense spend or infrastructure spend. We've heard various jurisdictions of Europe make commitments in that regard. But we're seeing opportunities across all developed markets and across emerging markets and across various industries. You can imagine, and we probably have to remind ourselves, that most of the AI ecosystem is located offshore. While the hyperscalers are here in the US, it's the equipment companies and the testing and packaging companies and the
Yeah.
semiconductor manufacturers that are really driving that growth.
Alaina,
And they're located outside the US.
I'm so sorry to jump in. Sit tight. I just want to go to our shot at the White House right now, where we see President Trump flanked by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy and French President Emmanuel Macron, in addition to other European leaders, including European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, and Finnish President Alexander Stubb. This is what's called and referred to as the family photo taking place live right now at the White House.
Alaina, let's get back, though, to what you were just talking about.
Just a reminder that all these leaders are in Washington today, and what they're doing is they're really trying to negotiate on behalf of Ukraine, discuss with President Trump a way to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine. A reminder that President Trump, at the end of that, I don't want to call it a press conference. It wasn't a formal press conference, but he took questions from the press in the Oval Office in the last 90 minutes or so alongside Volodymyr Zelenskiy of Ukraine. And he said that he would call President Putin of Russia to push for a trilateral with Zelensky. He said that at the end of their meeting. The leaders of these European countries and the leaders from Europe, along with Zelensky and President Trump, have now retreated from that family photo to ostensibly continue discussions at the White House. We'll continue to bring you updates from the White House as we do get them.
And we will go back now to Alaina. Alaina, you were mentioning the supply chain investing. One of your top holdings here, TSMC, that's a stock that has had an incredible run lately. I'm wondering how you kind of square continuing to invest in semiconductors with, of course, concerns about valuations.
Sure, valuations are a key part of our due diligence process, and we are focused on looking at long-term value creation. So we're always balancing our notions and thoughts on long-term value creation with risk reward. And so we still see that the risk reward for a company like TSMC is quite favorable. And that is because they have an unrivaled position as a global leader in semiconductor manufacturing. They're only increasing their footprint globally. And we feel like they're very well entrenched, and that really does underpin how we think about risk reward for TSMC.
Do you rethink at all your geographic allocation here based on macroeconomic events, or do you look at these solely based on companies? And the reason I say macroeconomic events, I'm not just talking about conflict like we're talking about right now and risks to the European continent, for example. What I'm referring to is tariffs, for example. Like, do you rethink your investments in these companies outside of the US as a result of American policy?
Certainly. While we are fundamental bottom-up investors, it is hard to invest internationally without some consideration for macroeconomics or geopolitics, particularly in the current environment where geopolitics are becoming so fractured and where macroeconomic considerations are becoming so robust these days. So we are looking at those companies that should be somewhat insulated from tariff policy that seems quite volatile. How do we lean into companies that have more of a domestic demand architecture in terms of how they generate revenues rather than a U.S. Revenue generated base? And in that way, we've been able to find a number of leaders for our portfolios or lean harder into names that we own. I think it's one of the reasons why defense has been getting such a bid, not only because of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but also because that spending is largely local rather than export-based and should be somewhat insulated from tariffs.